really honored to have Lina here with us to conclude the day. Lina has been at the center of some of the most consequential debates in antitrust policy, and first as a scholar and then as an enforcer. And as the chair of the FTC, she has helped push antitrust beyond the price of facts and toward deeper questions about power, structure, innovation, and democratic accountability. I'm very much looking forward to using this time to step back from the specific discussion that we had today and just talk about where antitrust is headed and what tensions you see and how you think about market power. And so over the course of today, we've talked about shifting bottlenecks from the industrial area, pipelines, and railroads to the digital area, and now to what increasingly looked like a layered AI stack. And so I would like to ask, from your point of view, where do you think that market power is most likely to harden next?
Well, first of all, it's so wonderful to be here, and I know I'm coming at the end of a rich day of fruitful conversations. So, our approach at the FTC was really to look layer by layer and understand, be it at the chip layer, be it at the kind of cloud infrastructure layer, the model, at the applications, what are the unique economic properties of each of these layers, and what are the potential risks that each of them could serve as a bottleneck. I think we're seeing a lot of developments happening very quickly. It's really impossible to think about the market power and monopoly power questions without it being against the backdrop of the landmark antitrust lawsuits that were filed over the last few years against Google, against Facebook. Many of those decisions are also directly shaping what the future competition landscape is going to look like. I think most notably with the Google decision, which the Department of Justice won, but then I think got a pretty weak result on the remedies front. And just this week, we learned that they're going to be appealing. I think that was a decision that suggested the judge was really committed to the view that generative AI was going to somehow be a competitive displacement to search. And therefore, whatever competitive advantages Google had conferred for itself in search were somehow much more vulnerable to threat because of generative AI. And I think that kind of misunderstood the way that all of the advantages in various AI markets, especially generative AI, are actually layered on top of the data advantages that precisely allowed Google to become so dominant. So, I think a lot of these questions are developing in tandem based on the fact that many of the incumbents that had managed to develop gatekeeper roles with Web 2.0 are now trying to extend those footholds into AI. And so I think that is against the backdrop of a lot of these competition questions.
And to this point, do you think that it's mostly about controlling inputs or controlling the different layers, or coordination across layers as well?
I think it's multiple things. I think it's absolutely wanting to have unique and preferential access to essential inputs, if not outright controlling or owning them. I think it's wanting to control access to distribution channels, which is what we've seen in particular with Google, and we just saw an announcement that they're going to be partnering up with Apple. So it's going to be Google's models that are going to be powering basically Siri and a lot of the Apple ecosystem models, which again is very resonant with what we saw in the search era, right? And so I think there had been this question as to, are we going to be learning the lessons of Web 2.0 and how we approach competition in AI? And I worry that some of the outcomes of these antitrust lawsuits suggest no. In fact, we may actually be seeing a replication. So I think there are going to be traditional questions around, monopolization, around foreclosure, around who has unique access. we are also seeing a different set of questions around pricing strategies, pricing coordination. How is some of this software and some of these algorithms potentially now enabling what we have traditionally thought of as collusion, but in a much more systematic way? There are various cases pending before various courts, bringing to the surface in the context of housing, most notably the RealPage litigation. But courts are really coming out in different places when it comes to this question of, if you have a set of rivals that are all submitting competitively sensitive information to a common company that is then delivering an algorithm, with various pricing recommendations, in what instances do we view that as traditional price fixing versus not? A lot of these questions are also coming to the fore with regards to first-degree price discrimination, which, the kind of possibilities of that, I think, are becoming much more distinct. And then I would say there's a third bucket with regards to what used to be traditional questions around interlocking directorates and conflicts of interest, and some of these kind of circular financing deals that we're seeing, the fact that you have, many of these rivals invested in one another's products, and whether that is softening what should be independent centers of competitive decision-making and actually giving firms outsized control over the trajectory of what should be distinct competitive decisions. So I think those are kind of three separate buckets that I see as being real competition questions right now.
And to go a little bit deeper in the last bucket that you mentioned, we've seen that we have a lot of partnerships and investments. And how do you think that antitrust should think about this arrangement that some people call mergers without mergers? What is your thinking?
Yeah, I think there's two slightly different categories here. One is the set of strategic partnerships and investments that we started seeing a few years ago. When I was at the FTC, we actually did a preliminary inquiry and put out some findings trying to understand what were the contractual provisions underlying these strategic investments. To what extent was certain amounts of business being committed to the hyperscalers in ways that could further tilt the market. And I think that is separate from the questions around these reverse acqui-hires. So when you see some of these firms, basically swoop in, hire up the top talent, in some instances pair that with exclusive licensing deals for some of the assets, but not actually buy the company outright. And at the end of the day, the antitrust regime, including both the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act and the Clayton Act, are supposed to be about substance and function rather than form. And so, enforcers in the last administration, as well as enforcers in this administration, have been very clear that to the extent that some of these pseudo acquisitions are being structured, effectively as avoidance devices, that should very much be within the purview of the antitrust laws.
Thank you. And we talked today a little bit about remedies, and it's very difficult with this technology that changes so fast to figure out what the right remedies are, especially because and we've seen that with Google, for example. What do you think that are remedies that actually work, and what people underestimate about remedies?
I think there's a formal approach to remedies when it is resulting from, an antitrust case that results in a liability decision. And I think in those instances, the traditional principles have been, you want to stop the illegal conduct, you want to stop its recurrence, and you also want to, restore the competition that has been lost. And I think courts have really struggled with that. In part, they've struggled with that because there has been such a huge lag between the anti-competitive conduct and now reaching the remedies question. And so there's been a real calcification of the, illegal fruits of that illegal conduct in terms of just how entrenched these positions have been. And I think, the bottom line is, it is much easier to use relatively light touch, minor interventions early to prevent that illegal dominance from calcifying than it is a decade on, sometimes 15 years on, where the nature of the intervention that would be needed to really fix those issues becomes much more heavy-handed. And so, I think that's why where you start seeing again some of these exclusive deals that if they had been prevented a decade ago, perhaps could have altered the trajectory of the search market, it should raise some concerns. I think those set of narrow antitrust remedies are separate from broader policy questions around things like conflicts of interest or how certain companies being integrated across various parts of the stack could be shaping their innovation incentives, right? And so the fact that many of the same firms that are leaders in these models are also massive hyperscalers that are benefiting from all of the spend on compute, does that mean that they have more of an incentive, or at least not as, does that mean they're not as incentivized to actually deliver more efficient models because they're actually doing pretty well when there is enormous usage of compute and power? And I think this question came to the fore in particular a little over a year ago, where we saw the release of DeepSeek, which was one of the first times that the U.S. had to reckon with an alternative model that rivaled U.S. models in sophistication, but actually was much more efficient. And I think that type of efficiency question as to are these firms going to be the ones that are best positioned and best incentivized to deliver those efficient models is a key question when you get this type of vertical integration.
In our last panel, we have talked a little bit about harm that go beyond antitrust, and most people experience market power through frustration, hidden fees, lock-in, opaque algorithm. And how do you think that antitrust should engage with these kind of experiences?
Yeah, there's obviously a quality dimension to market power, monopoly power. Again, we've seen that in some of these lawsuits that were filed against the tech giants. There was evidence that both Google and Facebook and Amazon were all able to make strategic decisions that were degrading the performance or quality of their platform from the user perspective. And in some instances, there was a deliberate recognition that they could achieve that degradation and the increased monetization without major consumer defection. And so that type of illustration can be an example of direct evidence of market power, monopoly power, and the courts engaged with that. In the Facebook example, it was a degradation of privacy, where there was some evidence that users were really frustrated with breach after breach that was exposing very sensitive data. But by that time, after Facebook had bought up Instagram and WhatsApp, including the kind of more privacy respecting parts of WhatsApp, there weren't real alternatives. I think there is this broader conversation around the life cycle of a platform and what its incentives might be at stage one when it is seeking to achieve a major user base and really start developing and locking in the network externalities and the accelerated growth and momentum that can come with being in an early lead position. And then what the incentives become once you've actually locked in that advantage and are benefiting from the moat and the entry barriers. And people like Cory Doctorow have written, I think, quite effectively about this, around how in phase two, the kind of monetization strategies kick in that do result in degradation, but by that point, the competition has really withered away such that people don't have real alternatives. So I think there's a part of this conversation that is very much going to be part and parcel of antitrust analysis, even traditional antitrust analysis. And then some of it is going to be kind of broader features or results of a lack of competition, but not necessarily, be something that the agencies are directly examining.
And if we look back at the last cases that we've seen with Google or with Meta, has your idea of a win changed since you were at the FTC? What do you consider a win in one of these cases?
I mean, when you bring a case, you want to, get the verdict in your favor and also get a remedy that's going to solve the underlying problem. And, I think it was a major achievement that the Justice Department won the Google search case, that they won the Google ad tech case. The FTC lost its Facebook case, which this administration is appealing. But again, I think the remedy's decision in Google search was quite disappointing and really raised this question of what was the value of the win if the market is not really going to be rectified from a competition perspective, especially when it comes to these next generation search technologies. There are also more legal wins along the way. Some of what those decisions achieved was a cabining of legal precedent that had previously had a real chilling effect on monopolization enforcement. I see some of my former antitrust students in the class, so they'll remember the famous Trinco case, which, for over a decade was cited as the case that has basically meant we can't bring Section 2 cases. And one thing that enforcers were able to do was show that the context in which the Trinco case was brought, which was telecom, that the economics of telecom are so different from the economics of digital markets that even if the Supreme Court's not going to outright overturn Trinco, lower courts should really cabinet to those set of facts, because digital markets have such different economics, have such different competition implications, that courts don't need to be restrained by Trinco. And so, that's a bit in the weeds, but those types of developments actually can have a huge effect, not just for the agencies, but for state attorneys general, for private enforcement, in terms of what even the scope of possibility is when it comes to future antitrust cases.
And to this point, we've seen that in the last 10 years, antitrust has changed a lot, has moved. And which changes do you think that are now institutional and they are unlikely to change again? Is there any change in particular that you think that will be now the standard going forward?
I mean, it's a very dynamic time in antitrust enforcement. I think this administration has kept more in place, both in terms of the cases that were pursued in the last administration, as well as things like the merger guidelines in terms of the principles that we use when analyzing mergers and acquisitions. That said, it's no secret that this administration across the board has a much greater appetite for side deals and settlements, even if they're not resolving the underlying competition issues. So I think we've seen some change there. I do think that we're going to continue to see the development of case law, both because the revived interest and enforcement activity has meant that there are just more cases that the courts are having to reckon with in terms of how these traditional antitrust principles, how statutes that go back to 1890 are actually going to apply in the digital age. And I think one of the real consequences of the drought in antitrust enforcement, especially when it came to monopolization in the early 2000s, was that the case law was stuck in place and was frozen in place according to a very different set of markets and a very different kind of industrial age era. And so the development of the law is a good thing. And I think as we see more and more of these decisions, not just in tech, but in the Ticketmaster lawsuit, in various cases that the FTC still has underway against healthcare monopolies, that there's just going to be more case law that's going to give more guidance as to what the state of the law actually is. I think in terms of what is durable, it does seem like there is a much broader awareness of anti-monopoly and antitrust as a set of tools that are available to the government, and that broadly are about promoting market competition, but also about promoting an economy that works for a broader subset of the population. And I think that awareness is going to be much more difficult to put back in the bottle. I mean, it was somewhat unusual to have a multi-decade period where antitrust had been relegated to primarily the realm of kind of technocrats and scholars and practitioners. If you go back and look at the 1912 presidential election in the United States, the main question that the three candidates had to answer was, what is your solution to the problem of the trusts? And it was, this issue of the monopoly problem and what government's going to do about it was just a much greater part of public discourse. That really changed, started in the 70s and 80s, and I think the pendulum has swung back again. And so, that's continuing to inform even how this administration is thinking about antitrust, how they talk about antitrust. It is much less technocratic, and so I think that continued exposure to kind of public debate and the public narrative is going to continue too.
And looking forward, what do you think now is some sort of a black box that academics should look at, or something that the courts need to be educated, something that still needs to be moved?
Yeah, I think this question of remedies is going to continue to be very important in digital markets, but beyond that as well. As I mentioned, these questions around coordination through algorithm and where the courts end up on that could be enormously significant. And to the extent that the courts de facto create a algorithm exemption to Section 1 price fixing, that would be pretty harmful to how we think about tried and true collusion. So I think those are areas where continued engagement and involvement through amicus briefs and opportunities to be kind of informing the courts both how these technologies work, but what the competition implications are is going to be really important.
I would like to ask the audience if anyone has a question for Lina.
Hi, my name's Marcella. I've been working on some legal research around the attention economy, and given that some of the worst actors in terms of commodifying and exploiting people's attentions are the monopolists we've been talking about today in tech, I'm wondering if you could speak to how antitrust litigation could be leveraged to rein in some of the attentional harms that these companies are imposing on consumers.
Yeah, from where I sit, I think some of those attentional harms are stemming more from the business model that these firms have chosen, in as much as some of these firms are looking to monetize attention or ultimately have, behavioral ad-based business models where their incentive is to keep users on the platform as long as possible, and then that extends to showing certain types of content and degrading other kinds of content. I think that is functionally a question of business model, which is separate from a question of market structure and competition. These things are very much related and intertwined, but I do think that those are going to be better addressed through direct policy levers, policy interventions, privacy laws, limits on how firms can use data or monetize data, rather than be addressed through antitrust directly. It has to be extraordinarily fact-specific, right? In as much as we're contemplating breakups as an antitrust remedy, you really do have to figure out, is this solving for the problem that we have diagnosed, and specifically the liability issue that we have found in terms of what is, the source of what is the illegitimate source of power here, or what is the illegitimate exercise of power here. And so I think there's one way to think about breakups in that camp. There is another way to think about breakups in a more policy regulatory intervention type of way, which is also part of the American legal tradition. There have been all sorts of infrastructure industries in particular where we have had structural separations and said that, if you own a railroad, you cannot also own a coal mine, for example, which was one of the first structural rules that Congress passed in the early 1900s, where there was this problem where the railroads were buying up all of these different, commodity assets, and then they were only transporting their own commodities and not really those of competitors. We've seen similar structural separation or conflict of interest rules at various points in telecom, even in banking with the separation of banking and commerce. And so I think that type of intervention is more directly targeting what we identify as a conflict of interest that is, just intolerable. So in banking and commerce, there was a view that because banks play such an outsized, important role when it comes to lending across the economy, we don't want those decisions about lending to be tainted by self-interest, such that a bank is, giving worse treatment to a retailer because of their own position. And so I think that type of policy conversation is probably going to be one that I think has been a bit more stunted in the U.S., given just the mass deregulation over the last few decades, but is one that we could also see come more to the surface, especially as breakups through antitrust, may be less likely.
Yeah, so how does industrial policy interact with your thinking about antitrust? So basically, on one hand, there seems to be a greater interest at the national level in coordinating behavior by these actors in the name of the interests of the United States. But on the other hand, the competition effects are going to be significant as well, almost by intention. So how do you see that discussion evolving in the next few years, given the forces at play?
And on the industrial policy front, are there any specific policy interventions that you're thinking about?
Well, for example, in chips, money is going to some, but not all, the makers of chips. Tariff policy has been tailored in a way that will have benefits and costs to different parts of the suppliers and the users of chips. One can easily imagine an AI policy that's going to move in that direction. So, I don't have a framework for analysis, but you may have thought some about this. And what are the things to be, another way to think of it, should we worry about this from antitrust perspective precisely because we're going to end up with sectors of the economy that are monoliths, but by design almost, as opposed, is that one of the costs of where we're headed now?
I do think there are first order questions as to what parts of the AI market or the AI sector are actually going to be governed by competition at all versus, characterized by much more consolidation and concentration. And to the extent that we are more in the latter bucket, there are a different set of tools that we have traditionally applied to try to check abuse of power rather than break it up. I think of industrial policy as serving a different set of goals and really putting the government in the position of making strategic decisions around, where it wants to promote certain types of economic activity or business activity, or what it decides is in the national interest in terms of really trying to shape, private market activity much more directly. I think there are instances